Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision, like engineering level precision.
Right. It's binary. It's clean.
Exactly. You break your radius, you go into the clinic, and the x-ray just shows that jagged white line. The doctor points to it, you look at it, and, well, the reality of the injury is right there on the whiteboard.
And psychologically, I mean, that's very comforting, right, for both the clinician and the patient. We like our pathology to be visible and easily categorized.
But then you step into the world of musculoskeletal disorders.
Mm-hmm.
You step into chronic low back pain or, the slow degeneration of cartilage, the systemic inflammatory diseases, and suddenly that x-ray machine is effectively broken.
Yeah, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
Because, unlike a clean fracture, the slow decay of our tissues isn't just about what's broken in a single moment. It's about the silent, decades-long accumulation of microdamage.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. The pathology just doesn't always match the patient's lived reality. And, the standard biomechanical fixes often fail completely.
Which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
We are mapping out the pathway from that initial invisible risk all the way to total system failure.
Right, moving from risk to exposure to outcome.
Yes, and finally, to system impact. So if you are a medical student, a junior doctor, a public health trainee, or a practicing clinician, you don't just need the raw epidemiological data.
No, you need the conceptual frameworks.
Exactly. You need to understand the reasoning and the systems thinking behind why public health manages these massive chronic burdens the way it actually does.
Yeah.
And today, we are actively reading alongside Chapter 8.9 of the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health.
And a really great way to ground that systems thinking, I think, is to change how we view the human body. When we look at musculoskeletal disorders, or MSDs, we shouldn't just picture a singular joint or, a single patient.
You get to zoom out.
Way out. We need to look at the human body, and by extension, the entire global workforce, as a nation's physical infrastructure.
Oh, I really love that framing. Like the bones, the joints, the connective tissues, they are the bridges, the highways, and the central support beams of a functioning society.
Exactly. And MSDs are rarely a sudden catastrophic collapse of that infrastructure. I mean, it's not a bridge just snapping in half out of nowhere on a sunny Tuesday.
Right. It's the deferred maintenance.
Yes.
It's the rust creeping into the rebar over 30 years. It's the stress of an aging population driving heavy freight trucks on the same old roads day in and day out until the microfractures link up.
And the harsh reality of public health is when that infrastructure fails, when those bridges literally can't carry the load anymore, the entire economy grinds to a halt.
Which honestly requires a massive philosophical pivot in how we approach global health.
Yeah.
Because for a century, public health has been fundamentally obsessed with mortality.
We track what kills us.
Right. We build surveillance systems for infectious diseases like malaria and tuberculosis. We track myocardial infarctions. We track oncology outcomes. But MSDs force us to pivot away from mortality and look directly at morbidity and disability.
The question is no longer just, well, what stops us from living? It's what stops us from living fully.
Let's unpack that entanglement a bit, because these disorders don't just exist in a vacuum. You don't just have an isolated bad knee while the rest of your health profile remains, perfectly pristine.
No, the degradation of the infrastructure complicates everything else. It creates this vicious clinical web.
Give us an example of that.
Well, consider the data from the United States. Roughly 50 million adults have a formal diagnosis of arthritis. But here is the critical intersection for a public health planner. Nearly 1 in 4 of those adults with arthritis, about 24%, also have heart disease.
Wow, a quarter of them.
Yeah, so put yourself in the shoes of their primary care physician. Your patient needs active cardiovascular rehabilitation. They need to be walking, swimming, elevating their heart rate to manage the lipid profiles and, the arterial plaques.
But their physical infrastructure is crumbling.
Exactly. Their hips and knees are in agony. How do they execute the cardiovascular intervention? They often just can't.
Because the conditions coexist, right?
They do. And they're driven by the exact same systemic determinants like obesity and physical inactivity. And the musculoskeletal failure severely blocks the management of the lethal disease.
It just tangles up the entire health system.
Yeah.
So before we look at the specific diseases, before we zoom in on the specific bridges that are failing, we need to look at the blueprint.
Right. To manage a public health crisis, you first have to classify it.
And in our field, that means grounding ourselves in the International Classification of Disease, the ICD-10 framework, which breaks this massive umbrella of MSDs into distinct diagnostic groupings based on the primary tissues under siege.
Let's run through these so everyone has the mental scaffolding. We start with the arthropathies.
Okay, arthropathies.
These are disorders predominantly affecting the limb joints themselves. And the mechanisms here are varied. You have conditions driven by microbiological agents, where pathogens initiate an inflammatory siege within the synovial fluid.
Leading to conditions like rheumatoid arthritis or juvenile arthritis.
Exactly. You also have crystal arthropathies like gout, where uric acid crystallizes in the joint space. It acts like microscopic shards of glass, essentially shredding the tissue from the inside out.
Ouch. And then we shift from the joints to the systemic connective tissue disorders.
This is where the blueprint really goes awry, because the body's own defense mechanisms turn against the infrastructure. We are talking about autoimmune cascades and collagen vascular diseases.
Like systemic lupus erythematosus.
Or Sjogren's syndrome, yes. The immune system is essentially ordering artillery strikes on its own healthy connective tissue, causing profound systemic inflammation.
Next up on the ICD-10 are the dorsopathies.
The central support pillars of the body. These are disorders of the spine, cervicalgia in the neck, sciatica shooting down the leg, and the absolute behemoth category of low back pain.
Which often involves the degradation of the intervertebral discs, the shock absorbers of the spine.
Right. Followed by soft tissue disorders. If the bones are the beams, the soft tissues are the cables and pulleys that actually move the structure.
So muscle strains, tendinopathies, bursitis.
It's a failure of the kinetic chain.
And finally, the osteopathies and chondropathies.
This is about the fundamental density and structural integrity of the materials themselves. Osteopathies are disorders of bone mass and architecture, like osteoporosis, where the bone becomes porous and brittle. Chondropathies affect the cartilage, the smooth, frictionless lining of the joints.
And it's crucial to realize that this infrastructure failure spills over into other diagnostic categories too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like carpal tunnel syndrome is essentially a musculoskeletal compression issue. But because it damages the median nerve, it's often grouped with nervous system diseases. Sprains and strains are usually dumped into acute injury statistics.
But functionally, they're all part of this exact same crisis of structural decay.
Okay, so now the universal question is, how does this decay actually initiate at a cellular level?
Well, tissue degeneration generally triggers from one of three primary pathways. First, systemic disease, like the autoimmune attacks we just mapped out. Second, acute macroscopic trauma, a high-velocity car crash, or a severe fall that alters the joint's biomechanics forever.
Or third, and probably most commonly, repeated biomechanical strain.
Yes, the daily wear and tear. The millions of repetitive loading cycles we put on our joints over decades.
Right, and all three of these pathways ultimately lead to the exact same destination, don't they?
They do. They lead to abnormal processes of gene expression in the tissue cells, incomplete cellular repair, and accumulated structural damage. And we can actually track this damage. We can use radiographic imaging, MRIs, or emerging serologic biomarkers to look at the torn ligaments, the narrowed joint spaces, the bone spurs.
Okay, here's where I need to push back. This is the exact moment where the X-ray metaphor breaks down, and I think a lot of clinicians and patients get tripped up here.
How so?
If I get an MRI of my lumbar spine, and the radiologist's report clearly shows disc herniation, tissue tears, and severe joint space narrowing, doesn't that inherently mean I have a disability? The bridge is visibly cracked on the scan. It seems like a one-to-one correlation.
It feels like it should be a perfect mathematical equation, right? Structural damage equals functional disability. But what's fascinating, and what the epidemiological data explicitly proves, is that this is largely an illusion.
Wait, really? A visible severe tear on an MRI doesn't cleanly predict if someone is actually disabled by it.
It absolutely does not. Radiographic evidence and biomarkers are surprisingly poor to moderate predictors of actual disability. You can take 100 older adults off the street who have absolutely zero back pain and put them in an MRI machine.
And what happens?
A massive percentage of them will show severe disc degeneration, bulging discs, and arthritic changes. They are walking around completely fine.
Wow.
Conversely, you can have two patients with identical MRIs showing identical severe structural degradation. One patient is completely bedridden, their life totally derailed, unable to hold a job. The other patient is, playing doubles tennis on the weekends, managing perfectly fine with an occasional ibuprofen.
That is wild. So if the structural damage to the bone and cartilage isn't the primary trigger dictating who becomes disabled and who doesn't, what is the variable?
The true overriding variable is the experience of pain. Specifically, how that pain signal is modulated, processed, and cognitively managed by the nervous system.
It's how the brain interprets the crack in the bridge.
Precisely. The pathway from microscopic tissue damage to macroscopic life disability is heavily mediated by emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and neurophysiological factors. We are talking about comorbid depression. We are talking about catastrophizing.
Let's explain catastrophizing because it's a huge concept in pain science. It's a cognitive process where the mind intensely fixates on the worst possible outcome of the pain, right?
Yes.
The patient feels a twinge in their back and their brain instantly loops. My spine is crumbling. I'll never walk again. My life is completely over.
Exactly. And that cognitive loop isn't just psychological, it becomes neurophysiological. It triggers what we call enhanced central nervous system pain processing, or central sensitization.
Central sensitization.
Yes. The brain essentially takes the volume knob on the nociceptive pain signals coming from the dust and it cranks it all the way up to 10. The central nervous system becomes hyperreactive.
So the pain is entirely real, but the volume is being amplified by the operating system rather than the hardware itself.
Exactly. So if you are a clinician treating an older adult with a musculoskeletal disorder, simply treating the radiographic joint damage, maybe doing an arthroscopic surgery to clean out the joint might fail completely.
Because you didn't treat the volume knob.
Right. Treating their comorbid depression or utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy to address the catastrophizing is often vastly more effective for actually restoring their physical function.
That is a profound aha moment. If you only look at the physical infrastructure, you miss the operating system that governs the whole machine.
You miss the forest for the trees.
Okay, now that we have this framework, understanding how tissue damage, pain processing, and mental health interact to create disability, let's shift into the clinical and epidemiological specifics. We need to look at the big five, the most globally burdensome conditions.
And we begin with the absolute heavyweight champion of global musculoskeletal burden, low back pain, anatomically defined as pain manifesting from the area between the 12th rib and the superior aspect of the gluteal fold, with or without radiating leg pain.
But the truly staggering statistic here is that in primary care settings, over 80% of low back pain cases are classified as non-specific.
Non-specific meaning that despite our best imaging and clinical exams, we cannot pinpoint a precise anatomical or physiological cause.
But to understand the mystery of the 80%, we first have to map out the 20% we actually can define.
Right. We divide specific low back pain into mechanical and non-mechanical origins.
Mechanical meaning actual physical structural impingements.
Exactly. The classic example is a disc herniation. The intervertebral disc has a tough outer ring, the annulus fibrosus, and a jelly-like center, the nucleus pulposus.
And if that outer ring tears,
the jelly pushes out and physically compresses the adjacent spinal nerve roots. It also releases a localized inflammatory soup that chemically burns the nerve, causing secondary edema and agonizing radiating pain.
Or consider spinal stenosis.
Yes. As we age, bone remodeling goes into overdrive, developing arthritic spurs on the vertebral bodies. These bone spurs grow inward, physically narrowing the spinal canal and choking the nerves and vascular structures.
And then you have the non-mechanical origins.
These are your red flags. Neoplastic diseases like bone metastasis from prostate or breast cancer, infectious conditions like osteomyelitis or spinal epidural abscesses, inflammatory arthritis.
But again, these specific mechanical and non-mechanical pathologies are the vast minority. The true public health crisis is the non-specific cases.
Yes.
And here's where I ran into a massive paradigm shift, an ergonomic surprise that completely upends common sense. I think the universal assumption for patients and employers alike is that if your back hurts, it's because you lifted a heavy box with your back instead of your knees.
Right.
Or you sit at a desk with terrible posture for 8 hours a day.
It is the most intuitive assumption in the world. It feels like basic physics.
But high-level meta-analyses and systematic reviews suggest that mechanical factors, things like awkward posture, manual material handling, pushing, pulling, or prolonged sitting, are actually not proven causal factors for the onset of nonspecific low back pain.
It is incredibly counterintuitive. Corporations spend billions globally on ergonomic chairs, standing desks, and workplace lifting seminars. Yet the highest level epidemiological evidence struggles to prove a direct primary causal link between those specific mechanical activities and the initial onset of the condition.
Wait, if it's not the chairs and it's not the heavy lifting, what is actually causing the infrastructure to fail?
This is where we return to systems thinking and genetics. The actual proven risk factors for a new episode of low back pain include poor general systemic health, female gender, older age, obesity, and smoking.
Smoking. How does inhaling tobacco smoke break your back?
It comes down to microcirculation. The intervertebral discs are the largest of vascular structures in the human body. They don't have a direct blood supply deep inside.
Yeah.
They rely on the diffusion of nutrients from the tiny capillary beds in the adjacent vertebral end plates. Smoking causes systemic vasoconstriction and endothelial damage, choking off that microscopic blood supply.
Oh, wow. So the disc just starves.
It starves, it dehydrates, and it degenerates faster.
That's fascinating. But the genetic component is even more mind-blowing. We're looking at specific genes like COMT and OPRM1.
Yes, the catechol methyltransferase gene and the mu-opioid receptor gene. And notice what these genes actually do. They do not dictate how thick your cartilage is or how dense your lumbar vertebrae are.
Right. The COMT gene is responsible for breaking down neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine. And the OPRM1 gene dictates the receptors where the body's natural painkillers, endogenous opioids, bind. These are genes implicated entirely in pain perception, pain signaling, and psychological processing.
Which perfectly validates what we discussed earlier about central sensitization. The disability of low back pain isn't just a mechanical failure of the tissue. It's a genetic predisposition to how the nervous system amplifies and processes the pain signal.
It's a biological volume knob. And understanding that completely changes the intervention strategy. If the root cause of the disability isn't purely mechanical, then purely passive mechanical interventions are going to fail.
Absolutely.
That's why shoe inserts, lumbar back supports, and programs that solely focus on reducing lifting loads are largely ineffective for actual recovery.
You cannot passively brace your way out of a neuromusculoskeletal problem. What actually works is active rehabilitation. Specific exercise therapies, graded movement interventions, and cognitive behavioral therapy. You have to actively retrain both the physical kinetic chain and the neurological pain pathways.
Okay, moving up the central support pillar. Number 2 in the big 5, neck pain.
Defined epidemiologically as pain lasting for at least 1 day, with or without radiating pain into the upper limbs, that causes some level of activity limitation. And much like the lumbar spine, the vast majority is nonspecific.
The Bone and Joint Decades Task Force provides a brilliant triage framework here, dividing it into grades through 4.
It's a highly functional clinical framework. Grade I neck pain has no major structural pathology and causes only minor interference with activities of daily living.
So the intervention there is just reassurance, basic pain control, avoiding over-medicalization.
Exactly. Grade 2 still lacks major structural pathology. No fractures or nerve compression, but there is major interference with daily living. The patient can't turn their head to drive. This requires early, active physical intervention to prevent chronic disability.
Then grade 3 is where the clinical picture darkens. You start seeing neurological signs.
Yes. Decreased deep tendon reflexes, asymmetrical muscle weakness in the arms, sensory deficits or numbness. This implies a nerve root is being actively compressed or irritated, requiring deeper imaging and targeted intervention.
And finally, grade 4.
Grade 4 is major structural pathology. A vertebral fracture, a spinal neoplasm, myelopathy where the spinal cord itself is compressed, or a systemic inflammatory disease. That requires prompt, often invasive or surgical investigation.
What really stood out to me regarding the natural history of neck pain is its intense chronicity. Between 50 and 85% of people who experience an episode of neck pain will report it again 1 to 5 years later. It's an endlessly relapsing condition.
And if we look at the variables that dictate that relapse, the psychosocial impact is massive. A younger age is generally associated with a faster physical recovery. But the most powerful predictors of a poor prognosis, meaning the pain becomes chronic and disabling, are poor psychological health, excessive worrying, and becoming angry or deeply frustrated in response to the pain.
Your literal coping style dictates your physical prognosis.
Quite literally. Patients exhibiting greater optimism, self-assurance, and less need to constantly socialize or focus on the pain are strongly associated with a better, faster recovery. Once again, the cognitive processing of the pain is the critical pathway.
Which brings us to the third major condition, shifting from the spine to the weight-bearing joints. Osteoarthritis, or OA.
OA is the classic degenerative disorder of the joints. It primarily attacks the articular cartilage, the smooth, gliding surface covering the ends of the bones, and the subchondral bone just beneath it. It overwhelmingly targets the hips and knees, but also frequently affects the hands, the lower spine, and the feet.
Here is where I had a massive misconception shattered. If you ask anyone on the street to picture osteoarthritis, They picture a mechanical wearing away. They picture the rubber eraser on a pencil just being passively ground down to the metal through sheer friction.
It is the most common analogy used, even by some clinicians, bone on bone.
But the pathophysiology is so much more dynamic than that. In the early microscopic phases of OA, the cartilage doesn't just passively rub away. It actually swells.
Yes. This is a fascinating cellular mechanism. Cartilage is maintained by cells called chondrocytes. When early microdamage occurs in the joint, these chondrocytes don't just surrender, they mount a massive, desperate repair response. They dramatically ramp up the production of proteoglycans.
Proteoglycans being these large molecules that attract and hold water.
Exactly. They act like microscopic sponges. So as the chondrocytes pump out more proteoglycans to heal the matrix, the cartilage draws in excess water and it physically swells.
That's incredible.
This hyperactive cellular repair phase isn't brief either. It can last for years or even decades. The joint is literally fighting back.
But eventually, it loses the war.
It does. The repair mechanism ultimately fails. The enzymatic degradation outpaces the synthesis. As the disease progresses, the swollen cartilage begins to soften. It loses its crucial elasticity.
And it starts to break apart.
Yeah, microscopic flaking and fibrillations like split ends and hair develop along the previously smooth gliding surface. Fissures deepen, exposing the subchondral bone, which responds by becoming dense and sclerotic.
And that's when you finally get the classic radiographic presentation, the loss of joint space and the grinding bone-on-bone pain. Now, the risk factors driving this process are critical for public health. We have primary OA, which is driven by age, female sex, and genetic predisposition without a clear single trigger.
Right. And secondary OA, driven by underlying conditions like metabolic disease or congenital joint dysplasia. But the modifiable risk factors are where the battle is won or lost.
And the two massive modifiable targets are obesity and heavy occupational physical activity.
The biomechanics of obesity on the knee joint are just staggering. It's not a one-to-one force ratio, is it?
Not at all. When you walk, the force across your knee joint is roughly 3 to 6 times your body weight, depending on the incline and speed.
3 to 6 times.
So an extra 10 pounds of body weight translates to an extra 30 to 60 pounds of sheer compressive force across the articular cartilage of the knee with every single step you take. Over millions of steps, that exponentially accelerates the degradation of the chondrocytes we just talked about.
Furthermore, a history of acute joint injury, like a torn ACL or meniscus, is massively associated with the later development of OA. The initial trauma alters the joint's kinematics, creating abnormal focal pressures that initiate that doomed repair cycle.
Number 4 on our list shifts focus from the cartilage back to the architecture of the bone itself.
Osteoporosis. The World Health Organization defines osteoporosis via bone mineral density using a T-score. A T-score compares a patient's bone density to the optimal peak bone density of a healthy young adult.
Okay, so what are the thresholds?
A T-score of minus 2.5 or lower, meaning 2.5 standard deviations below that young adult mean, is the diagnostic threshold for full osteoporosis. A score between minus 1 and minus 2.5 is classified as osteopenia, which is a precursor state.
The best way to visualize this pathophysiology is to treat bone mass exactly like a retirement bank account.
It's a perfect analogy.
In postmenopausal women who bear the brunt of this disease, 2/3 of their risk of suffering an osteoporotic fracture is dictated by the peak bone mass they achieved before they went through menopause.
Quite, before the estrogen drop.
That peak mass is the total sum of the deposits you made into your skeletal bank account during your youth and early adulthood, driven by nutrition, calcium, and weight-bearing exercise.
And the rate of bone loss after menopause, accelerated by that sharp drop in estrogen, represents the withdrawals.
Exactly. Our bones are not static concrete pillars. They are living, dynamic tissue constantly undergoing remodeling. This remodeling is a tug-of-war between two types of cells. Osteoclasts, which are cells from the macrophage lineage that secrete acid to dissolve and destroy old bone-making withdrawals.
Right.
And osteoblasts, which are mesenchymal stem cells that synthesize and deposit new bone matrix-making deposits. Osteoporosis is simply the dysregulation of this cellular economy. The osteoclasts become overactive, the withdrawals outpace the deposits, and the internal honeycomb structure of the bone thins out until the structural integrity catastrophically fails.
And the margin for error in that structural integrity is razor thin. Epidemiological data shows that for every single standard deviation decrease in the bone mineral density of the spine, the risk for a new vertebral fracture doubles. It increases by a factor of 2.0 to 2.4.
Double the risk for a single standard deviation drop. That is terrifying when you consider the aging demographics.
It is a slow-motion public health hazard. The risk factors are largely non-modifiable. Advancing age, female gender, and race, with white and Asian women at significantly higher risk than Black women due to inherent genetic differences in peak bone mass accumulation.
But the modifiable lifestyle factors play a huge role in the withdrawal rate, don't they?
Absolutely. Physical inactivity, inadequate calcium and vitamin D, heavy alcohol consumption, and smoking all accelerate the osteoclast activity.
Which brings us to the final of the big five, rheumatoid arthritis, or RA.
We need to draw a sharp contrast here. Osteoarthritis is fundamentally degenerative, a failure of biomechanics and cellular repair. Rheumatoid arthritis is fundamentally systemic and autoimmune.
A totally different beast.
It is characterized by chronic symmetrical inflammation of the synovial joints. The immune system misidentifies the synovial membrane as a foreign threat and attacks it. This leads to profound synovial hypertrophy, severe inflammation, and the formation of a pennus.
A pennus.
An aggressive tissue that literally invades and dissolves the adjacent cartilage and subchondral bone.
The epidemiology of RA is a masterclass in gene-environment interactions. Globally, the prevalence hovers around 0.5 to 1%. But if you look at the geographic distribution, the variation is massive.
It is a classic epidemiological signal. You see the prevalence sitting incredibly low, at 0.2 to 0.3% in rural populations of Japan and China. But then you look at specific Native American populations like the Pima and Chippewa tribes, and the prevalence explodes to 5.3 to 6.8%.
Which means we're looking at a genetic susceptibility.
A powerful genetic susceptibility, specifically variations in the HLA-DRB1 gene complex interacting with highly specific environmental triggers.
And what is the most powerful environmental trigger pulling the pin on that genetic grenade?
Tobacco smoke. Exposure to tobacco smoke is the strongest, most consistent modifiable risk factor for the development of RA.
Wait, how does smoke trigger an autoimmune joint disease? That sounds entirely unconnected.
It alters the proteins in your lungs. The toxins in the smoke cause a biochemical process called citrullination in the airway tissues. If you have that genetic susceptibility, your immune system suddenly recognizes these citrullinated proteins as foreign invaders.
Oh, wow.
It generates anti-citrullinated protein antibodies, or ACPAs. These antibodies circulate systemically, eventually finding their way to the joints, where they trigger the massive inflammatory cascade that destroys the synovial tissue.
That is incredible. The destruction of the knee or the wrist actually begins with altered proteins in the lung. And the clinical treatment reflects that systemic inflammatory mechanism. You can't just treat RA with ibuprofen and an ergonomic keyboard.
No, you have to actively suppress the immune system's friendly fire. First-line therapies like NSAIDs and corticosteroids manage the acute pain and rapid swelling, but the true disease management relies on DMARD's disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, like methotrexate or advanced biologic agents. These drugs intervene at the cellular level to thwart the immune cascade, halt the progressive joint destruction, and push the disease into remission.
Okay, we have thoroughly mapped the clinical mechanisms of the Big Five. We understand the blueprints, the cellular breakdowns, and the neurobiology of the disability. Now, we have to zoom out. We need to look at the global ledger. How does this cellular failure translate into macroscopic systemic impact?
If we look at the definitive data from the 2010 Global Burden of Disease study, the raw human scale of this problem is staggering. In the year 2010, an estimated 1.7 billion people globally suffered from musculoskeletal disorders.
1.7 billion. That is nearly a quarter of the global population walking around with compromised physical infrastructure.
And to truly quantify the weight of that burden, we have to meticulously define the metric used by health economists and epidemiologists, the daily, the disability-adjusted life year.
Let's break the daily down clearly because it is the fundamental currency of global public health policy.
A daily is a measure of overall disease burden. It represents one lost year of healthy life. It allows us to compare the impact of vastly different conditions, like a lethal heart attack versus chronic back pain on an equal playing field. The daily is calculated by summing two distinct metrics, YLLs and YLDs.
YL being years of life lost.
Yes, years of life lost due to premature mortality. If a disease kills a person 10 years before their statistical life expectancy, that disease generates 10 YLLs. Historically, this is where all the public health funding went.
Because it's easy to measure death.
Right. The other half of the equation is the YLD, years lived with disability. This is calculated by taking the prevalence of a condition and multiplying it by a highly specific disability weight, a score from 0 to 1 reflecting the severity of the condition's impact on a person's daily life.
So if we apply this math to MSDs, where does their burden actually come from?
This is the philosophical shift we mentioned at the beginning. MSDs exert their massive societal burden almost entirely through YLDs. You do not typically die from a herniated disc or an osteoarthritic knee. You live with it. You live with it for 30, 40 years, carrying a high disability weight every single day.
Although we should note a fascinating caveat regarding osteoporosis. The mortality rate is actually increased following a major osteoporotic event, like a hip fracture.
It absolutely is. The one-year mortality rate following a hip fracture in an older adult is alarmingly high, often exceeding 20%. But here is the data quirk, that death isn't attributed to osteoporosis on the death certificate.
Right, it's attributed to the complications.
Exactly. It's attributed to the secondary complications of being bedridden, the pulmonary embolism, the pneumonia, the cardiovascular collapse. So the true mortality impact of MSDs is actually significantly undercounted in global statistics.
But even with that mortality undercounted, the YLDs generated by MSDs are catastrophic. The data shows that between 1990 and 2010, the dailies due to MSDs grew globally by 45% in absolute terms. They skyrocketed from being the 11th highest priority among all assessed health conditions globally in 1990 to the 6th highest in 2010.
And we have to look at the economic shockwave this creates. MSDs account for roughly 25% of all illness-related expenses in developed nations. But the true terror for a finance minister isn't the medical bill, it's the ratio of direct to indirect costs.
Direct costs being the MRI scans, the arthroscopic surgeries, the methotrexate prescriptions, the physical therapy sessions. Indirect costs being the lost workforce productivity, the sick days, the disability pensions, the early forced exit from the labor market.
Exactly. Look at the health economic data from Sweden regarding low back pain. The direct medical costs were calculated at $24 per capita. The indirect costs were $266 per capita. In the Netherlands, it was $24 direct and $299 indirect.
That means over 90% of the total economic cost of back pain is tied up purely in lost human capital. It's the factory worker who can't stand at the assembly line, the surgeon who can't stand at the operating table, the farmer who can't harvest the crop. The true cost of an MSD isn't the pill to treat it. It's the total loss of the economic engine.
And this economic loss is amplified by demographic targeting. We often dismiss MSDs as simply old people diseases, a natural, unavoidable part of getting gray hair. But the epidemiological data shows that MSDs begin significantly impacting quality of life and generating YLDs as early as age 10 to 14.
And the prevalence curve peaks when?
It peaks precisely between the ages of 35 and 64.
Which is the exact apex of a human being's economic and societal productivity. You are at the absolute height of your career expertise. You are likely supporting both dependent children and aging parents. You are contributing maximum income taxes to the state. And that is precisely the decade when the musculoskeletal infrastructure is most likely to structurally fail.
It is a perfect storm for macroeconomic collapse, which forces us to ask the systemic question. Why is this burden growing so rapidly? Why did we see a 45% explosion from 1990 to 2010?
That brings us to the determinants. We can call them the four horsemen of musculoskeletal decline, the systemic macro trends driving this epidemic.
The first major determinant is what we can call the paradox of technology.
Calling it a paradox feels almost cruel, because on one hand, we've achieved miracles. We've used modern medicine, sanitation, and vaccines to drastically reduce infant mortality and extend the human lifespan globally.
Yes, the world's median age shifted remarkably from 23.9 years old in 1950 to 29.2 in 2010. We have successfully kept the population alive longer.
But the paradox is that we haven't upgraded the physical chassis to last that long. We've kept the engine running, but the shocks and struts are giving out. The infrastructure simply has decades more time to experience biomechanical wear and tear.
Precisely. And the second half of that paradox is that technology has simultaneously engineered physical exertion out of our daily lives. We sit in cars instead of walking. We sit at computers instead of performing manual labor. We use washing machines and tractors. This drastic decrease in baseline physical activity directly drives the second horseman, the obesity epidemic.
The global BMI shifts are just wild. If we look at the data from 2008, the highest BMIs globally were found in Oceania, with nations like Nauru hitting a staggering average of 35.0 kilograms per meter squared for women. Contrast that with Bangladesh, which sat at an average of 20.5.
But the critical factor for global health planning is the rate of change in lower and middle-income countries. They are experiencing rapid, unprecedented annual increases in overweight and obesity populations. We are now seeing high levels of obesity in rural areas of developing nations where, just a generation ago, malnutrition and underweight were the dominant public health crises.
And it's not just the drop in physical activity, it's the globalization of food systems, the infiltration of highly processed, energy-dense foods. The textbook notes that the daily caloric intake for children and adolescents in the U.S., aged 2 to 19, jumped from 2065 calories in 2003-2004 to 2,952 calories in 2005-2008.
A nearly 900-calorie jump per day for children, established over just a 4-year period.
So let's connect the dots. We have massive systemic shifts in the modern environment. We have global acculturation, an increase in eating processed foods away from home, and shifts in workforce participation, altering traditional household cooking patterns. These macro-social changes translate directly into increased systemic caloric intake.
Which translates directly into an increased population BMI.
Right, and that increased mass translates directly back into the 3 to 6 times multiplier of biomechanical compressive force on the articular cartilage of the knee that we discussed earlier.
It is a brilliant, tragic straight line, from globalized agricultural trade policy and food marketing straight down to the cellular degradation of the chondrocytes in a single patient's knee. The systemic invariably drives the cellular.
It's incredible. So, having diagnosed the patient and having diagnosed the systemic failures of the environment, well, how do we rebuild the infrastructure? Let's move into policy, governance, and clinical practice.
If we start at the macro level policy, the governance of health, we have to confront the reality of social inequality. The International Labor Organization, the ILO, tracks worker protections globally. They report a devastating statistic. Only 1 in 5 adults globally has adequate sick leave coverage.
Only 20%, meaning 80% of the global workforce simply cannot afford to take a day off if they are in physical pain.
And remember the triage framework for neck pain and back pain. We established that early active rehabilitation and temporary load modification are strictly required to heal acute strains and prevent chronicity.
But if a worker lacks sick leave, they are forced to return to the factory floor and work through that minor back strain.
Exactly. They pushed the damaged tissue beyond its limits day after day. Because of that economic coercion, the minor acute strain irreversibly transitions into a chronic, severely disabling structural condition. The lack of social protection literally manufactures the long-term disability.
And that structural inequality extends to how we finance healthcare itself.
Yeah.
We see the 2080 syndrome in global health spending.
Yes. The OECD countries, the highly developed, high-income nations, contain less than 20% of the world's population, but they consume over 80% of all global health resources. Conversely, in low-income countries, up to 50% of all health expenditure is paid completely out of pocket by the individual patient at the point of care.
And when you have to pay out of pocket, cash on the barrel, you simply don't seek early intervention for an aching knee or a stiff lower back. You wait until you physically cannot walk to the fields.
And by the time you finally see a clinician, the joint is completely destroyed. The window for cheap, effective rehabilitation is closed, and you now require a prohibitively expensive joint replacement that you will never receive.
So knowing all these systemic barriers, what macro interventions actually work to bend the curve? The most successful public health strategies utilize intersectoral collaboration, bringing together health, agriculture, trade, and education. We can contrast two highly successful yet distinct national approaches to combating the dietary drivers of MSDs, Finland and South Korea.
Finland utilized a very aggressive top-down integrated approach. Recognizing the catastrophic trajectory of their cardiovascular and obesity rates, the Finnish government implemented aggressive national price policies, taxing unhealthy components and strict mandatory food labeling policies.
And public education, right?
Yes, they coupled this with massive public educational programs. They used the hard levers of state economic regulation to physically change the food environment and alter what the population consumed.
South Korea, on the other hand, took a much more culturally embedded, community-driven approach.
South Korea was facing a massive influx of westernized, energy-dense diets due to globalization. But instead of relying solely on taxation, The government invested heavily in cultural preservation. They provided localized community workshops specifically targeting new brides and young mothers. They actively educated these women on how to prepare traditional, vegetable-rich, low-fat Korean dishes, preserving the cultural palate, and actively steering the next generation away from adopting Western-style fast food.
And the data shows it worked. South Korea managed to maintain significantly lower obesity levels than would be expected for a rapidly industrializing country of its high income level.
It perfectly demonstrates that public health interventions must be culturally specific and intersectoral. You cannot just tell an orthopedic surgeon to fix the national obesity problem in the operating room. You need agricultural policy, trade tariffs, and cultural education all working in tandem upstream to protect the joints downstream.
And speaking of the clinician on the ground, let's bring it back to the individual patient encounter. For the medical students and junior doctors listening, the key clinical takeaway from managing MSDs loops all the way back to our very first concept regarding the X-ray.
The disability trigger. Pain processing. If you are a clinician treating an older adult who comes in with severe osteoarthritis of the hip, you cannot just look at the radiographic joint damage and schedule a replacement. You have to screen the operating system.
Because treating their comorbid depression or addressing their severe anxiety regarding the pain might be the single most effective intervention for restoring their ability to walk.
Exactly. Successful management must occur early, and it must be holistic. You have to screen for catastrophizing, for sleep disturbance, for depressive disorders, because those neurological and psychological factors are the ultimate drivers that convert a damaged tissue into a disabled life.
When you step back and look at the whole picture, the paradigm shifts entirely. We started by realizing that the visible tear on the MRI isn't the true predictor of disability, the nervous system is. We realized that expensive ergonomic chairs aren't the magic cure for back pain, but active exercise and smoking cessation are. And we traced the degradation of microscopic cartilage cells all the way up to globalized food supply chains.
It is the ultimate exercise in public health systems thinking.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, a synthesis of everything we've uncovered today. Consider the macroeconomic reality of our global systems right now.
The demographic time bomb.
Exactly. As the global population ages, governments worldwide are panicking about the insolvency of pension funds. The universal, frantic policy response across Europe, the Americas, and Asia is to push to raise the retirement age. They want to mandate that citizens work until they are 67, 68, or even 70 years old. But based on the epidemiology we've discussed today, how can a society physically function if the musculoskeletal infrastructure of its workforce fundamentally begins to crumble precisely between the ages of 45 and 64?
It's an irreconcilable policy conflict. You cannot legally mandate a longer working life without first preserving the physiological capacity to perform that work.
If disability, not mortality, defines the modern disease burden, then simply saving a life from a heart attack is no longer the finish line. Public health must figure out how to preserve the structural integrity of that life. What good is engineering a society where everyone lives to be 85 if they spend the last 30 years of that life unable to stand up without agonizing pain?
Solving the musculoskeletal crisis is not just a medical imperative. It is the defining economic and public health challenge of the aging century.
Okay, let's lock this knowledge in. For the trainees and clinicians listening, I'm going to fire off some rapid-fire single best answer recall prompts based on the core frameworks of today's deep dive. I will pause briefly after each question. I want you to actively recall the mechanism and answer it in your head before we give the solution. Question 1. When evaluating an older adult with a musculoskeletal disorder, which crucial variable is actually a better predictor of long-term disability than the severity of structural damage seen on radiographic imaging? Answer. The patient's pain processing in the presence of comorbid depression. For consolidation on central sensitization and the disability trigger, revisit the section on pathophysiology and treatment. Question 2. True or false? Awkward occupational posture and heavy manual material handling are the proven primary causal factors for the initial onset of nonspecific low back pain. Answer. False. High-level meta-analyses suggest these mechanical factors are not primarily causal. Systemic factors like poor general health, genetics like the COMT gene, and smoking play larger roles in onset. Revisit the section on risk factors for LBP.
Question 3. In the early microscopic pathophysiological phases of osteoarthritis, what actually happens to the physical state of the articular cartilage before it eventually degrades? Answer. The cartilage swells. This is due to a hyperactive repair response by chondrocytes, resulting in increased proteoglycan production, which draws in excess water. Revisit the section on the pathophysiology of OA. Question 4. What is recognized as the most consistent and powerful modifiable environmental risk factor for triggering rheumatoid arthritis in genetically susceptible individuals? Answer: tobacco smoke exposure, which induces citrullination of proteins in the lungs, triggering the systemic autoimmune response. Revisit the section on risk factors for RA. Question 5. In global health economics, which specific metric best captures the true long-term societal and economic burden of musculoskeletal disorders? Years of life lost, YLL, or years lived with disability, YLD? Answer: years lived with disability, YLD, as MSDs are primarily chronic, non-fatal conditions that severely degrade quality of life and workforce participation over decades. Revisit the section on the burden of MSDs.
Excellent work synthesizing these mechanisms today. Keep reading the primary sources, keep questioning the simple mechanical assumptions, and always look for the connections between the cellular pathology and the systemic environment.
We will see you on the next deep dive. Here are the details of this episode.
Musculoskeletal disorders. Byline: the hidden burden of pain, disability, and aging in global population health. Oh no. Episode description. Musculoskeletal disorders are among the leading causes of disability worldwide, contributing significantly to years lived with disability across all regions. Conditions such as low back pain, osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and osteoporosis impose substantial personal, social, and economic costs. This episode explores global epidemiology of musculoskeletal conditions. This episode explores aging populations and rising disability. This episode explores occupational and ergonomic risk factors. This episode explores physical inactivity and obesity. This episode explores inflammatory and degenerative mechanisms. This episode explores chronic pain and mental health intersections. This episode explores work disability and productivity loss. This episode explores fracture risk and osteoporosis prevention. This episode explores health system responses and rehabilitation models. This episode explores. Although musculoskeletal disorders are rarely fatal, they profoundly affect quality of life, workforce participation, and health expenditure. Their impact often accumulates gradually, reflecting aging, occupational exposure, and long-term biomechanical stress. This episode explores. Prevention strategies include workplace design, early intervention, physical activity promotion, and fall prevention in older adults. Addressing musculoskeletal health requires integrating clinical management with occupational policy, urban design, and aging strategies. This episode explores disability, not mortality, defines much of modern disease burden. This episode explores. Key takeaways. This episode explores. Musculoskeletal disorders are a leading cause of global disability. This episode explores. Aging populations are increasing prevalence. This episode explores. Occupational exposures contribute significantly to risk. This episode explores. Obesity and inactivity exacerbate degenerative conditions. This episode explores. Early rehabilitation improves long-term outcomes. This episode explores. A chronic pain intersects with mental health. This episode explores. Prevention spans ergonomics, activity promotion, and fall prevention.